In the heart of every civilization, power has always been a double-edged sword. It promises glory, wealth, and immortality in the annals of history. Yet, power, unchecked and absolute, has the capacity to corrupt, to bend the course of nations, and to leave behind a trail of suffering that echoes across generations. This is the story of one such man, a tyrant whose rise was meteoric, whose grip unyielding, and whose fall inevitable. He was born into a world already teetering between order and chaos. A child of privilege yet marked by ambition, he learned early that the world was governed not by fairness, but by cunning. In the quiet corners of his childhood, he observed the machinery of influence, those who commanded obedience without question, and those who fell into obscurity when they faltered. Gifted in intellect, ruthless in strategy, he navigated the corridors of learning in early politics with a precision that bordered on predation. His peers would later recall a presence that demanded attention, a mind that dissected intentions before words could betray them. Here, in the crucible of youth, the foundations of tyranny were laid, not through force, but through understanding the human thirst for order, fear, and loyalty. His first steps into governance were marked by subtlety. Power rarely arrives in open confrontation. He mastered the art of persuasion, the quiet undermining of rivals, and the cultivation of loyalists. Each promotion, each accolade, each whispered endorsement, became a brick in the edifice of his eventual dominion. To the outside world, he was competent, visionary even. But those who watched closely recognized the pattern of control, the hunger for influence that would eventually become insatiable. As his authority expanded, the machinery of the state bent to his will. Laws were rewritten, alliances forged and broken, dissent neutralized with a precision that few could see coming. The people celebrated his victories, unaware that each triumph subtly eroded the liberties that had once been their safeguard. The tyrant did not arrive as a tyrant. He evolved, step by meticulous step, embedding himself in every facet of governance. Yet, history demonstrates that no rule, no matter how cunning, is immune to resistance. Small acts of defiance emerged. Scholars, politicians, and citizens alike began to question the narrative carefully crafted by their leader. Behind closed doors, in dimly lit rooms, a fragile network of opposition began to form. Each whisper, each note passed in secrecy, carried the weight of hope and danger alike. Power is a lonely companion. Surrounded by sycophants and allies who feared betrayal as much as they craved favor, the tyrant's world became increasingly isolated. Decisions were no longer guided by counsel but by the echo of his own ambition. Friends became tools, advisors, pawns, loyalty, a currency to be spent and extracted. The closer one stood, the greater the risk of falling. And yet, within the inner circle, the seeds of collapse were quietly sown: jealousy, envy, and the inevitable realization that no empire survives on fear alone. At the zenith of his power, the tyrant seemed invincible. The world observed from afar, mesmerized by the spectacle of absolute control. Orders were obeyed without question. Opposition was silenced with a subtlety that belied its brutality. Yet, in these moments of apparent omnipotence, the foundation of decline was already being laid. History has repeatedly shown that empires built on fear and deception are as fragile as they are grand. And for him, the first tremors would come not from external enemies, but from the very structures he had forged to ensure his dominance. By the time he had fully consolidated his power, the tyrant's presence was everywhere, yet he was nowhere. His decrees shaped the lives of millions, yet he rarely appeared in public beyond carefully staged spectacles. Every law, every policy, every public appearance was meticulously orchestrated to reinforce the perception of invincibility. Those who questioned him vanished into obscurity or worse. Fear became both shield and sword, a mechanism that guaranteed loyalty and punished hesitation. He built a network of surveillance so pervasive that no conversation, no letter, no gesture went unnoticed. Spies infiltrated households, workplaces, and even religious institutions. Loyalty was no longer voluntary, it was demanded. And yet, within this web of control, an unexpected paradox emerged. The more tightly one seeks to bind a society, the more one isolates oneself. The tyrant, ever calculating, failed to perceive that fear may command obedience, but it does not inspire trust or love. Every triumph was broadcast as a personal achievement. Parades, military drills, and grand celebrations masked the growing unease beneath the surface. Propaganda glorified the tyrant as a savior, a visionary, a father of the nation. The citizenry, dazzled by spectacle, rarely saw the cost: the quiet suppression of dissent, the slow erosion of civil liberties, the mounting tension that would eventually erupt. But even the most meticulously maintained power cannot extinguish the spark of resistance. In the shadows, small groups of intellectuals, former allies, and disillusioned citizens began to organize. Messages were passed in secrecy, pamphlets were circulated under cover of night. What began as murmurs of dissent soon grew into an underground network, united by the shared belief that no tyranny, no matter how absolute, is permanent. The tyrant's closest confidants, once bound by fear and ambition, began to question their own survival. Ambition, envy, and resentment became quiet weapons. The inner circle, those who had been his most loyal allies, started to calculate their own futures. In tyranny, the higher one climbs, the more precarious the position. Trust becomes currency, and betrayal, inevitability. While grand ceremonies suggested stability, whispers in marketplaces and villages told another story. Citizens began to murmur about rising taxes, forced conscription, and arbitrary punishments. Small protests, quickly suppressed, revealed the limits of fear. Even in silence, dissatisfaction began to accumulate, invisible yet powerful, a tide ready to surge against the walls of authority. Alone in his private chambers, he confronted a reality he could never fully control: the human mind. His genius had constructed empires and quelled opposition, yet it could not predict the unpredictability of loyalty, the subtle erosion of faith, or the quiet courage of those who opposed him. Even the most calculating mind eventually faces the chaotic rhythm of history, and here, in these solitary hours, the seeds of downfall were already taking root. The world outside was not idle. Neighboring powers observed with caution, some plotting intervention, others testing the limits of his authority. Diplomacy, trade, and alliances became battlegrounds where subtle challenges were as dangerous as overt rebellion. A tyrant's strength is measured not only by his control within, but by his ability to navigate the ever-shifting currents beyond his borders. Every empire contains a turning point, a moment when ambition and hubris intersect with opposition and circumstance. For this tyrant, that moment was approaching. Invisible currents of betrayal, dissent, and miscalculation converged. The machinery of control, once seemingly perfect, began to creak under the weight of its own complexity. And as history would show, even the most formidable despot is never immune to the subtle forces that conspire against absolute power. No empire is built without challenge, and no tyrant remains untested. The first signs of failure appeared not in public spectacle, but behind closed doors. Campaigns faltered, advisors disagreed, and alliances proved fragile. Decisions once regarded as genius began to show cracks. History often measures greatness by victories, but it measures downfall by hesitation and miscalculation. For this ruler, the first misstep would cascade into a series of errors that even his cunning could not contain. Even within the inner circle, loyalty proved conditional. Allies who had once advanced his ambitions began to question their own security. Secret communications were exchanged, promises reneged upon, and ambitions redirected. Betrayal, subtle yet lethal, became a weapon wielded from within. The tyrant, preoccupied with controlling the masses, failed to see the slow erosion of trust among those closest to him. And in tyranny, the fall of the inner circle is often the precursor to the fall of the ruler himself. The people, who once marveled at his power, began to recognize its consequences. Taxation, conscription, and restrictions bred resentment. Murmurs became whispers, whispers became chants, and chants became protests. The tyrant had underestimated the capacity of society to endure injustice before rebelling. Each suppressed demonstration only fueled determination, and each act of oppression left a deeper scar upon the fabric of his authority. His response was predictable, and predictable in its peril. He relied on force, intimidation, and propaganda to maintain control. Every decree, every punishment, was meant to restore order, yet it exposed the limits of power. Fear, once a tool of obedience, became a mirror of vulnerability. With each act of suppression, the cracks widened, the undercurrent of dissent growing stronger and more coordinated. Even family proved complicated. Blood does not always guarantee loyalty. Advisors and relatives, once instruments of consolidation, began to question not only his morality but his judgment. The tyrant's reliance on manipulation created a delicate ecosystem. Remove one piece, and the entire network threatens collapse. And when ambition resides alongside fear, trust is the first casualty. The world beyond his borders took notice. Rivals tested his resolve, exploiting internal weaknesses and plotting their own ascendance. Diplomatic overtures became traps, military maneuvers tested loyalty, and the tyrant faced challenges he could not simply decree away. History repeatedly shows that isolation is the tyrant's silent adversary. When the ruler relies solely on fear within and misjudgment without, collapse becomes not a question of if, but when. Power, absolute and unchecked, exacts a psychological toll. In solitude, the tyrant wrestled with doubt, paranoia, and the specter of betrayal. Decisions once made with unyielding confidence now bore hesitation. Fear, the very tool that had once secured obedience, began to infiltrate his mind. The line between loyalty and treachery blurred. History often portrays tyrants as invincible. The truth is they are often prisoners of their own ambition. In the shadows, opposition organized with precision. What began as scattered whispers coalesced into strategy. Former allies, intellectuals, and military officers plotted in secrecy. Each decision they made was informed by a deep understanding of his weaknesses. Conspiracies, like slow-moving storms, gathered force silently, unseen by the very individual they aimed to unseat. The tyrant, focused on appearances and minor threats, remained oblivious to the monumental danger brewing beneath the surface. The first act of high-level betrayal arrived like a lightning strike. Trusted confidants undermined his authority, misdirected forces, and leaked critical information. For the first time, the tyrant's meticulous control failed. Panic, frustration, and anger replaced the composed authority he projected. The audience, both his citizens and history itself, witnessed the moment when invincibility began to falter. In tyranny, even a single betrayal has the power to unravel decades of dominance. The fabric of his empire began to show the strain. Offices once filled with activity lay deserted, the public became cautious, and whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire. The machinery of control, previously seamless, now faltered. Decision-making slowed, alliances wavered, and the tyrant's aura of invincibility diminished. In this quiet decay, the inevitability of collapse grew more pronounced. Society, once paralyzed by fear, began to sense vulnerability. Even minor acts of defiance took on monumental significance. Rumors of dissent circulated through streets and alleys, symbols and slogans appeared in hidden corners. The people began to grasp a simple truth: tyranny, for all its apparent strength, is mortal. And once the perception of weakness emerges, the tide of history begins to turn. The tyrant's dominion, once meticulously organized, began to crumble in silence. Advisors delayed decisions, military units hesitated, and bureaucracies faltered. The very structures he had built to enforce obedience were now instruments of disorder. In tyranny, control is never absolute. Fragility hides behind spectacle. And the higher one climbs, the harder the fall. The betrayals that had whispered in shadows now became visible acts. Former allies allied with foreign powers, close advisors undermined critical operations, even family members questioned loyalty. The tyrant, so accustomed to silence and obedience, faced the terrifying reality that those closest to him could, and would, turn against him. Fear, once a sword, became a mirror reflecting his vulnerability. What had begun as whispered discontent erupted into open rebellion. The citizens, emboldened by the cracks in authority, demanded change. Streets once silent under curfew now echoed with defiance. Barricades went up, confrontations with armed forces became inevitable. The tyrant's response, once swift and unquestioned, now faltered under the weight of simultaneous crises. In desperation, he attempted to reclaim control. Military campaigns, public addresses, and sweeping decrees were launched in rapid succession. Yet each measure, conceived in urgency, revealed miscalculations. Allies were overextended, the population emboldened, and the machinery of governance unable to respond to the speed of decay. History shows that desperation often accelerates collapse rather than preventing it. Isolation became absolute. The tyrant, once surrounded by loyalists, now faced only suspicion and fear. Trusted voices were gone or silenced. Each decision was made alone, each risk weighed in solitude. In these moments, the psychological toll of unchecked ambition revealed itself. Paranoia replaced confidence. Hesitation replaced decisiveness. The empire he had constructed was beginning to slip through his fingers. Those who had prospered under his rule now calculated survival without him. Advisors and generals, once instruments of his will, quietly aligned with opposition forces. The inner circle fractured, leaving the tyrant exposed. Power, once absolute, relies on perception. And when the perception falters, the illusion of control collapses. The machinery of authority fell apart with alarming speed. Units refused orders, civil servants deserted posts, and the population seized the opportunity to assert control. Each day brought new setbacks, each decision a gamble increasingly doomed to fail. The empire he had built through fear, manipulation, and ambition now seemed to resist him at every turn. In solitude, the tyrant confronted the enormity of his failure. For decades, he had calculated, manipulated, and imposed. Yet the human spirit, unpredictable and resilient, proved a force he could not command. The very strategies that had secured loyalty now felt hollow. The victories of the past offered no shield against the inevitability of collapse. The final betrayal came swiftly. Trusted confidants, seeking to preserve themselves, abandoned him at the crucial moment. Plans were leaked, forces withdrawn, and opportunities lost. The tyrant, confronted with the convergence of internal and external opposition, recognized the magnitude of his isolation. In that instant, the end of his reign was no longer a possibility, it was certainty. The streets, once subdued by fear, now became theaters of reckoning. Citizens confronted the symbols of tyranny with courage and defiance. Military units, fractured and uncertain, hesitated as the population asserted control. The illusion of absolute power disintegrated under the combined weight of rebellion, betrayal, and miscalculation. The tyrant's authority, once omnipresent, vanished before the eyes of the world. In the final hours, the tyrant faced the consequences of ambition and tempered by foresight. His empire, a monument to control and fear, lay fragmented. Offices abandoned, palaces empty, and streets reclaimed by those he had ruled. History's judgment, impartial and unyielding, had arrived. The fall was swift, yet inevitable, a reminder that tyranny, no matter how brilliant or ruthless, is always mortal. In the wake of collapse, society began the slow work of recovery. Governance restructured, citizens reclaimed agency, and the legacy of fear lingered like a shadow over the newly restored order. History offers no redemption for tyranny, it records the consequences, warns the ambitious, and immortalizes the lessons of hubris and ambition. The tyrant's rise had been meteoric, his fall inevitable, and the story, etched into the annals of time, remains a testament to the enduring tension between power and morality. When the dust settled, the world he had dominated seemed quieter, smaller, and yet strangely resilient. Buildings remained, streets remained, but the machinery of fear that had held society in thrall was gone. Power, once absolute, had proven fragile. History demonstrates that empires built on coercion are often the first to crumble. The people, when given opportunity, reclaim what tyranny temporarily stole. The citizens, once silenced by fear, returned to public life with renewed vigor. Governance, though fragile, began to reflect the will of those it served. Civil society, long dormant, awoke. These moments of quiet reclamation are often overlooked in chronicles of power, yet they are the foundation upon which stable societies are rebuilt. The fall of a tyrant is not simply an end, it is the restoration of agency, the rebirth of public trust. Historians study the rise and fall of such figures not for spectacle, but for understanding. The trajectory of tyranny is rarely linear, rarely predictable, yet certain patterns emerge: ambition unchecked by ethics, power concentrated in isolation, fear used as currency, and dissent underestimated. Each of these elements, present in the tyrant's story, contributed to the inevitability of collapse. And history, patient and impartial, records these lessons for those who choose to see them. Beyond politics, the tyrant's story is a study in human psychology. The pursuit of absolute control, while seductive, isolates, distorts, and eventually destroys. The mind that once orchestrated empires becomes prisoner to paranoia. The relationships forged in ambition decay under mistrust. Even brilliance cannot outlast the consequences of moral compromise. In solitude and defeat, the tyrant's humanity, flawed, brilliant, and tragic, becomes clear. The ripple effects of tyranny extend beyond borders. Neighboring states, once cautious or complicit, recalibrate. Trade, diplomacy, and alliances are reshaped. The tyrant's downfall serves as a lesson not only for those within his dominion but for the global community. Unchecked power, no matter how entrenched, creates instability that eventually demands correction. In the wake of collapse comes the arduous work of renewal. Infrastructure is rebuilt, governance reformed, and civic institutions restored. Culture, education, and public dialogue flourish once more. These processes, gradual and painstaking, ensure that the lessons of tyranny are woven into the fabric of society, providing resilience against the recurrence of similar abuses of power. The tyrant's shadow does not vanish entirely. Monuments, memorials, and oral histories preserve the memory of his deeds, both the brilliance and the brutality. These reminders serve as cautionary tales. Power, while seductive, carries responsibility. Ambition, while necessary, requires restraint, and fear, while effective, cannot substitute for justice or morality. History's verdict is clear: tyranny may shape a generation, but it cannot dictate the course of centuries. The story of the tyrant is ultimately a story of human nature: desire and fear, ambition and conscience, cunning and error. It demonstrates the tension between authority and liberty, control and chaos, individual ambition and collective will. Power is neither permanent nor inherently just. Its true measure is the legacy it leaves behind, whether it fosters freedom or fear, justice or oppression, hope or despair. The rise and fall of a tyrant is more than a tale of one man. It is a mirror for every society, every generation, and every individual who wields influence. History is not merely a record of events, it is a guide for understanding the delicate balance between ambition and morality. And in the final analysis, the lesson endures: no power, however absolute, can escape the consequences of its own design. Civilizations endure not because tyrants rise or fall, but because people, resilient and vigilant, reclaim their world. The story ends not with the man, but with the enduring truth of human agency. Power may corrupt, fear may dominate, and ambition may blind, but history, impartial and inexorable, ensures that the world continues, and that the lessons of the past are never forgotten. While history remembers rulers and battles, it is often silent on the lives caught in the shadow of tyranny. Farmers, merchants, scholars, and children navigated a world dictated by fear. Some adapted, others resisted quietly. Everyday acts, sharing forbidden texts, teaching banned ideas, sheltering dissenters, became invisible forms of courage. Their stories reveal the subtle, enduring defiance that ultimately shapes the arc of history. Tyranny does not only suppress people, it suppresses culture. Books were burned, art censored, and ideas policed. Language itself became a tool of control. Yet culture cannot be extinguished indefinitely. Following the tyrant's fall, a renaissance quietly unfolded. Writers reclaimed voices, historians chronicled truth, and music and theater celebrated resilience. These acts of creation became the foundation upon which memory and identity could survive oppression. To understand tyranny, one must examine ideology, the reasoning, often twisted, that justifies domination. The tyrant spoke of vision, unity, and destiny. Yet beneath rhetoric lay fear, greed, and an obsession with control. His ideology, once persuasive, ultimately became a blueprint for his own undoing. Power untempered by ethics is like a river without banks. It eventually overflows, drowning all it touches. Across borders, the rise of the tyrant elicited intrigue, alarm, and opportunism. Observers noted the consolidation of power, the subtle use of propaganda, and the erosion of civil liberties. Some plotted intervention, others waited for weakness. The international stage, ever vigilant, underscores that no tyranny exists in isolation. History is shaped not only by internal decisions but by the reactions of the broader world. The mind of the tyrant is paradoxical, brilliant yet trapped, commanding yet isolated. Decisions once taken with clarity became clouded by paranoia. Trust eroded, ambition mutated into obsession. Psychological studies, both modern and historical, reveal that absolute power often amplifies fear and self-deception. The tyrant's trajectory demonstrates that dominance may be achieved through cunning, but maintained only through vigilance, and even then, collapse remains inevitable. While the center of power experienced grand upheaval, smaller, localized acts of rebellion were occurring simultaneously. Villages resisted conscription, towns refused decrees, communities protected dissenters. These small acts, seemingly insignificant, accumulated like sparks before a storm. Tyranny underestimates the power of distributed resistance, a lesson that echoes in countless historical precedents. In a rare bid to reclaim legitimacy, the tyrant attempted gestures of conciliation. Speeches promised reform, policies suggested compromise, and symbolic acts sought to mollify opposition. Yet these measures were too little, too late. Trust once broken cannot be restored with words alone. Redemption, in the eyes of history, requires both sincerity and restraint, qualities absent in those who wield fear as authority. Physical monuments often outlive rulers, becoming symbols of both power and oppression. Palaces, statues, flags, and public buildings bore the mark of the tyrant's vision. Yet these symbols are double-edged. They inspire awe, but they also serve as reminders of human ambition gone unchecked. After the fall, many were repurposed, dismantled, or recontextualized, signaling society's attempt to reclaim history and assert moral judgment. Stories are preserved not only in documents but in memory. Oral histories capture fear, hope, courage, and folly. Children learned of both heroism and oppression through storytelling. Communities transmitted lessons that official records sometimes omit. These narratives ensure that the tyrant's impact is neither forgotten nor romanticized. They teach vigilance, resilience, and the cost of unchecked ambition. The tale of a tyrant is ultimately a reflection of humanity itself. It asks fundamental questions. How should power be wielded? What is the relationship between authority and morality? Can ambition coexist with ethics? History offers answers, not in absolutes, but in patterns, repeated cycles of rise and fall, dominance and collapse, hubris and consequence. In studying the tyrant, societies study themselves. The story of one tyrant is rarely unique. Across centuries, rulers have risen, each guided by ambition, fear, and circumstance. From distant lands to neighboring empires, similar patterns emerge: consolidation through fear, manipulation of allies, and the ultimate fragility of absolute control. By studying these parallels, history offers insight not only into the individual, but into the timeless dynamics of power itself. While history records rulers and battles, the true cost is measured in lives disrupted, families uprooted, and communities scarred. Children went hungry, families were separated, and livelihoods destroyed. Tyranny transforms the ordinary into collateral. Its victims are often invisible to the annals of history. These human stories, quiet yet persistent, are the enduring markers of oppression's legacy. No tyrant rules alone. Advisors, generals, financiers, and diplomats all play their part. Some act out of fear, others from ambition, still others from conviction. Together, they create a network that amplifies both power and corruption. Yet when trust fractures, these enablers can become instruments of downfall. The more concentrated power becomes, the more dependent a ruler is on the integrity and loyalty of those closest to him. In every epoch of oppression, resistance persists. Ordinary people, teachers, farmers, soldiers, engaged in quiet defiance, passing forbidden texts, hiding fugitives, sending intelligence. These small acts, seemingly insignificant, accumulate into movements capable of toppling empires. History consistently demonstrates that tyranny cannot suppress the human desire for freedom indefinitely. Beyond immediate suffering, tyranny often erases memory. Libraries are burned, manuscripts destroyed, and ideas suppressed. Yet culture finds ways to endure. Scholars preserved texts in secret. Artists encoded messages in their work. Memory became resistance. The restoration of knowledge after the tyrant's fall is a testament to resilience, proving that ideas cannot be silenced forever. In his final days, the tyrant faced the consequences of decades of ambition and fear. Isolation, betrayal, and the collapse of control stripped him of the illusions that had sustained his power. Where once there were advisors, generals, and sycophants, there was silence. The tools of domination, the very instruments that had elevated him, had become meaningless. History often portrays these moments as dramatic, but their quiet devastation is equally compelling. The climax of tyranny often comes suddenly. Some rulers are captured, others flee, and some face judgment or exile. These moments crystallize the consequences of absolute ambition. The world watches as illusions of invincibility are shattered. For the tyrant, no strategy, no fear, and no charisma can reverse the tide of consequence that history itself has set in motion. After the fall, societies begin the arduous process of reconstruction. Civic institutions are restored, local governance re-established, and justice systems recalibrated. Ordinary citizens reclaim agency and rebuild their communities. These processes are gradual but essential. They demonstrate that the story of tyranny does not end with the ruler, but continues in the resilience and recovery of the people. The narrative of a tyrant is also a moral mirror. It illustrates the dangers of unrestrained ambition, the consequences of fear-based rule, and the fragility of power built on coercion. Every rise and fall carries lessons, that leadership without conscience invites collapse, that trust cannot be replaced by intimidation, and that the human spirit cannot be suppressed indefinitely. These lessons endure across generations, shaping the ethical frameworks of societies long after a tyrant is gone. The rise and fall of a tyrant is more than a historical event, it is a reflection of timeless truths. Power is fleeting, ambition is fragile, and morality is the measure that history ultimately honors. While individuals may dominate for a time, societies endure because of collective resilience, courage, and conscience. The tyrant's story ends, but the lessons remain, etched into the consciousness of humanity. History remembers tyrants not merely for their deeds, but for the lessons they leave behind. Their names are etched in chronicles, their actions dissected by scholars, and their failures studied as cautionary tales. The tyrant's rise and fall is a mirror reflecting the enduring tension between ambition and morality, power and justice. Every empire has its shadows, and every shadow teaches us something about the human condition. Societies memorialize tyranny in many ways. Statues are toppled or repurposed, museums preserve records, oral histories ensure that neither triumph nor suffering is forgotten. These acts of remembrance are not only historical, they are moral. They remind future generations of the fragility of power and the cost of ambition untethered from conscience. Beyond monuments and archives, the human stories endure. Survivors recount what it was like to live under control and fear. Letters, diaries, and oral testimonies preserve the emotional truth of tyranny, the sacrifices, the resilience, and the courage of ordinary people. These narratives are the heartbeat of history, reminding us that the measure of a ruler is never in power alone, but in the lives touched by it. The tyrant's story provokes reflection. What makes power just? How does ambition remain ethical? When fear governs, morality erodes. Philosophers and scholars across centuries have debated these questions, recognizing patterns that recur across time and place. Tyranny is a human phenomenon, but its lessons are universal. The concentration of power without accountability is a danger to all societies. Though this story belongs to the past, its echoes resonate in the present. Across nations and generations, leaders confront similar temptations: the allure of unchecked authority, the suppression of dissent, the manipulation of perception. The patterns remain, and the lessons endure. Vigilance, civic engagement, and moral clarity are the safeguards that prevent history from repeating itself. After tyranny, culture flourishes. Music, literature, and art reflect both memory and hope. Public debates and civic engagement thrive once more. In these acts of creation, societies reclaim not only their freedom, but their identity. Tyranny, no matter how absolute, cannot extinguish creativity or conscience. And in this renewal, humanity asserts its resilience. The physical remnants of tyranny tell stories themselves. Palaces overgrown, statues toppled, empty halls echoing with silence. Ruins are not just debris, they are symbols of impermanence, reminders that no human construct, no matter how mighty, can withstand the passage of time and the will of the people. Leadership carries responsibility. Ambition, vision, and courage must be tempered by ethics and accountability. History teaches that those who rule through fear may succeed temporarily, but true endurance requires legitimacy, consent, and empathy. These principles, derived from tragedy and triumph alike, remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Ultimately, the story is about people, their resilience, ingenuity, and courage. While tyrants may rise and fall, societies endure through the collective strength of their citizens. Communities rebuild, knowledge is preserved, and life continues. Tyranny leaves scars, but humanity's capacity to adapt, resist, and thrive endures. The rise and fall of a tyrant is a story of power, ambition, and consequence. Yet it is also a story of human endurance. It reminds us that history is shaped not by fear alone, but by courage, wisdom, and conscience. Power may dominate for a time, but morality, resilience, and collective action endure. And so, as the shadows of tyranny fade, the light of history illuminates the enduring truth. Societies survive, people reclaim their world, and the lessons of the past remain a guide for generations yet to come. Tyranny is not only felt in palaces or battlefields, it pervades daily life. Families learned to speak cautiously, merchants adapted to unpredictable laws, and children grew up understanding that silence could be survival. These ordinary lives, often invisible in history books, carry the weight of oppression and the subtle heroism of endurance. Even in the shadows of oppression, courage manifests quietly. Teachers risked imprisonment to educate, scholars preserved forbidden texts, and communities created networks of knowledge and defiance. These acts, often imperceptible, accumulated into the foundations of future liberation. Isolation breeds paranoia. Surrounded by flattery and fear, the tyrant began to mistrust every whisper. Decisions once made with clarity now faltered under suspicion. History repeatedly demonstrates that the greatest threat to a tyrant is often the human mind, his own, distorted by ambition, fear, and the illusion of control. Even familial bonds, once assumed sacred, became instruments of power or betrayal. Relatives sought self-preservation, alliances shifted, and loyalty was measured not by love, but by convenience. Tyranny isolates even those closest, and the personal becomes political, with devastating consequences. Not all resistance was grand or public. Soldiers defected, villages hid dissidents, and local leaders quietly undermined oppressive policies. These small acts, seemingly minor in isolation, collectively became a force that the tyrant could neither anticipate nor control. Culture survived beneath the surface. Songs encoded protest, paintings expressed forbidden truths, and oral histories preserved memory. Tyranny may attempt to silence art, but creativity persists. Through these forms, societies remember, mourn, and prepare for renewal. Beyond borders, other powers observed and reacted. Trade restrictions, diplomatic maneuvers, and covert support for dissidents chipped away at the tyrant's control. No empire exists in isolation. Even absolute power must contend with the global web of influence, where opportunity and vulnerability are constantly tested. Physical remnants of tyranny tell stories of impermanence. Empty halls, toppled statues, and overgrown courtyards serve as reminders that human constructs, no matter how grand, are subject to decay. They are monuments not only of power, but of its inevitable fragility. After the tyrant's fall, education and knowledge became the tools of reconstruction. Scholars catalogued history, citizens reclaimed lost rights, and schools became spaces where truth replaced fear. Learning itself became an act of liberation, a defense against the repetition of past mistakes. Years of fear leave marks beyond the physical. Citizens carry trauma, mistrust, and memory of injustice. Rebuilding requires more than structures, it requires healing of the collective psyche. Societies recover slowly, learning that the restoration of trust is as vital as the restoration of order. The story of one tyrant resonates across time and space. Patterns repeat: ambition, isolation, reliance on fear, eventual collapse. History offers lessons, visible to those who study carefully. Power without accountability invites destruction, and those who ignore human resilience do so at their own peril. Even in oppression, symbols endure. Graffiti, clandestine markings, and local monuments remind society of courage and defiance. They inspire hope, communicate truth, and teach future generations that no tyranny can completely erase conscience. Leadership is measured not by fear, but by the capacity to balance ambition with ethics. Empires built on coercion are temporary. Societies that cultivate participation, justice, and transparency endure. The tyrant's life serves as a cautionary tale for those who wield influence. Recovery is collective. Citizens rebuild infrastructure, revive commerce, and restore governance. Democracy, dialogue, and civic engagement flourish when fear is removed. The fall of a tyrant is only the beginning. The work of reconstruction determines whether freedom truly endures. The memories of oppression are passed down, intentionally or unintentionally. Stories of fear, resilience, and courage become part of collective consciousness. Education ensures that lessons are internalized, ambition must be checked, morality upheld, and vigilance maintained. The echoes of tyranny are visible today. Societies still confront leaders who test limits of power. Lessons from history remind us that vigilance, accountability, and civic responsibility are essential safeguards against the repetition of past mistakes. Art and culture reclaim spaces once dominated by fear. Music, literature, and theater flourish, preserving memory and inspiring hope. In reclaiming expression, societies reclaim their identity and affirm the resilience of human creativity. The tyrant's story teaches that power without conscience is fragile. Ambition unchecked leads to isolation, fear, and eventual collapse. Yet, within these tragedies, there is hope. Human resilience, morality, and collective will endure. History records not only failure, but the capacity to recover, rebuild, and flourish. Societies survive tyrants because of the quiet, persistent courage of ordinary people. Markets revive, schools reopen, and families resume the rhythms of daily life. History reminds us, while rulers may rise and fall, civilization endures through the agency of its citizens. The rise and fall of a tyrant is ultimately a story of humanity. It is about power and morality, fear and courage, oppression and resilience. The tyrant's story ends, but the lessons echo endlessly. Societies endure, conscience prevails, and the human spirit, tempered by history, continues to shape the world. For those tasked with enforcing power, the lines between duty and conscience blur. Soldiers, once instruments of the tyrant's will, faced impossible choices: obedience or morality, survival or integrity. Their stories reveal the human cost of tyranny, and the courage required to defy authority even in small, quiet ways. Merchants navigated tyranny with subtlety and skill. Taxes, inspections, and arbitrary fines demanded ingenuity and courage. Trade persisted, but survival required strategy, networks of trust, covert support for dissidents, and the silent transmission of knowledge became as vital as the goods they sold. Even the youngest felt the weight of oppression. Play and learning were constrained, words measured, gestures scrutinized. Yet children adapt, absorb, and remember. In their innocence, seeds of resistance and resilience are sown, quietly preparing a generation to reclaim freedom and shape history. Art often flourishes under restriction, carrying messages that words alone cannot convey. Pain and oppression gave rise to coded imagery, allegorical performances, and poems of defiance. These creative acts survive the tyrant's reach, preserving memory and inspiring hope long after fear has faded. In the countryside, resistance took a different form: small councils, covert planning, and guerrilla acts. Remote communities leveraged local knowledge and solidarity to challenge authority. Though minor in scope, these acts collectively destabilized the perception of invincibility, demonstrating the power of decentralized resistance. Information became a weapon. Spies, informants, and double agents infiltrated every level of society. The tyrant relied on intelligence to maintain control, yet those networks often contained the seeds of his undoing. Knowledge, manipulated or withheld, became both a tool of dominance and a vector of collapse. Nature often mirrors human events. Storms raged during campaigns, floods delayed supply lines, and seasons shifted to mark the passage of time. These elements became silent witnesses to ambition, failure, and endurance, offering a cinematic metaphor for the impermanence of human constructs. Spiritual leaders faced their own dilemma: to obey the tyrant or to guide conscience. Some complied, some resisted quietly, and others became beacons of moral courage. Faith, when wielded with integrity, inspired hope and solidarity, reminding citizens that authority alone cannot command the human spirit. Not all opposition came from grand uprisings. Subtle, internal political rivalries tested the tyrant's judgment. Ambitious rivals maneuvered within the system, exploiting weaknesses, and sometimes contributing inadvertently to collapse. History shows that internal dissent, however small, is a persistent threat to concentrated power. The landscape itself tells a story. Rivers carve paths through stone, mountains weather storms, and cliffs crumble under erosion. Like these forces, human ambition is shaped, tested, and eventually worn down. The tyrant's empire, impressive yet impermanent, mirrors these natural truths, grand, imposing, but ultimately vulnerable to forces beyond control. Alone, the tyrant confronted his legacy. Once confident, he now saw the cost of ambition and tempered by ethics, broken alliances, displaced citizens, and personal isolation. Reflection, though belated, revealed that power achieved without moral grounding is unsustainable, no matter how brilliant or ruthless. Amid oppression, acts of compassion persisted. Citizens protected the vulnerable, shared food with the hungry, and sheltered those targeted by authority. These small gestures of humanity, quiet and often unseen, preserved dignity and reinforced the moral fabric of society, even in the shadow of tyranny. The tyrant's story is not isolated. Across time, empires rose and fell under similar circumstances. Overreach, reliance on fear, betrayal, and underestimation of human resilience. By studying these parallels, societies gain insight into patterns of power, control, and collapse, offering lessons for generations to come. Music became more than art, it became coded communication, a vessel for dissent. Songs and rhythms carried warnings, encouragement, and solidarity. Even under surveillance, these melodies persisted, reminding society that culture can survive, resist, and inspire. As rebellion intensified, isolation became absolute. Allies vanished, advisors hesitated, and silence replaced loyalty. The tyrant confronted the stark reality that fear, once his tool, could no longer enforce obedience. History often emphasizes confrontation, but isolation itself is one of the most decisive agents of downfall. After the fall, rebuilding was complex. New governance structures emerged, legal systems were re-established, and citizens participated in shaping their own future. Authority, now tempered by accountability, became a force of stability rather than oppression. History demonstrates that recovery depends on inclusive leadership, not merely the removal of a tyrant. Lessons of tyranny are passed from generation to generation. Stories of fear, resistance, and courage become integral to identity. Education, both formal and oral, ensures that society internalizes the cost of oppression, cultivating vigilance and moral clarity in those who follow. Physical acts of renewal, planting, rebuilding, illuminating, mirror the restoration of society's spirit. These gestures symbolize hope, continuity, and collective resilience. Even amidst the remnants of tyranny, life asserts itself, and communities reclaim agency. The true measure of history is not in rulers, but in people. Families resume routines, scholars preserve knowledge, artists reclaim expression, and citizens rebuild their world. Tyranny may dominate for a time, but humanity persists, resilient and inventive, shaping the arc of civilization. The rise and fall of a tyrant is a story of power and consequence, ambition and morality. It is also a testament to human endurance, the persistence of conscience, and the collective ability to rebuild. Though rulers may come and go, societies endure. History, impartial and relentless, preserves lessons of tyranny and resilience alike. And in its enduring light, humanity continues to write its own destiny. All rulers rely on those closest to them. The tyrant's inner circle, once loyal, now wavered. Ambition, fear, and self-interest collided, and decisions became fractured. History shows that the strength of tyranny is often determined less by the ruler and more by the cohesion, or disintegration, of those around them. Even the smallest gestures matter. A symbol painted in secret, a line of forbidden text passed among students, a whispered warning to a neighbor. These acts of defiance accumulate over time, gradually eroding the power of fear. History remembers them as the quiet yet unstoppable currents of resistance. As dissent grew, the tyrant's mind became a prison. Every shadow was a threat, every loyalist, a potential traitor. Paranoia, once a tool of vigilance, now imprisoned him. The psychology of fear can strengthen a ruler temporarily, but unchecked, it accelerates isolation and collapse. Knowledge itself became rebellion. Scholars preserved forbidden texts, taught lessons in secrecy, and documented truth in defiance of censorship. These acts, often invisible at the time, ensured that memory and history survived beyond tyranny's grasp. Rebellion did not always announce itself with grandeur. Small, localized uprisings chipped away at authority. Villages organized, supply lines were disrupted, and morale faltered. The accumulation of these minor insurrections often proves decisive, undermining centralized power and eroding the illusion of control. Ambition exacts a personal toll. Family members turned cautious or distant, alliances dissolved, and intimacy became impossible. Isolation, once a consequence of paranoia, now became reality. Tyranny, while external in effect, devastates the private sphere as ruthlessly as the public one. Art and culture suffered under restriction, yet they endured. Theater was performed in hidden spaces, songs carried subversive messages, and visual art encoded resistance. Culture, suppressed physically, survived symbolically, preserving identity and memory. The natural world mirrors human events. Storms that disrupted campaigns, rivers that slowed armies, and the relentless passage of seasons reflected the impermanence of even the most seemingly absolute rule. Nature, indifferent to human ambition, becomes a cinematic witness to hubris and consequence. Advisors, often overlooked in grand narratives, determine the fate of rulers. Some acted out of fear, others from ambition. Their decisions, alliances, and betrayals were pivotal. History is shaped not only by the ruler's hand, but by those who influence it behind the scenes. The military, instruments of power, are ultimately human. Conscience and fear collide, producing hesitation, desertion, or outright rebellion. The tyrant's reliance on force is only as reliable as the loyalty of those who wield it, and human judgment cannot be entirely commanded. As rebellion spread, the tyrant reacted with urgency. Orders were rushed, policies inconsistent, and resources mismanaged. Desperation, historically, accelerates collapse. Rational strategies are replaced by instinct, often leading to catastrophic miscalculations. Communities quietly supported each other. Families hid fugitives, shared food, and protected knowledge. Ordinary acts of courage, multiplied across neighborhoods, contributed more to the downfall of tyranny than any single military campaign. Years of oppression leave scars that endure long after the tyrant is gone. Citizens carry fear, distrust, and memory of injustice. Recovery requires both structural reform and the slow healing of collective consciousness. The tyrant's story is echoed across centuries. Empires collapse due to overreach, fear-based governance, and underestimation of human resilience. Comparative history illuminates patterns. Power without accountability is temporary, resistance persistent, and morality a decisive factor in long-term survival. Symbols persist where words cannot. Murals, flags, and clandestine gatherings carry memory, defiance, and hope. They ensure that courage and conscience are remembered, even if the acts themselves are never recorded officially. Education becomes a weapon against oppression. Knowledge empowers citizens to reclaim agency, challenge authority, and restore society. Teaching truth and history safeguards against the repetition of past mistakes. In solitude, the tyrant confronts mortality and legacy. Years of ambition, fear, and cruelty are reflected upon. Isolation amplifies the realization that power, while intoxicating, is fleeting. Even brilliance cannot preserve the unmoored conscience. After the fall, society reconstructs systems of accountability. Courts, tribunals, and civic institutions ensure that justice is served. The law, once subverted, becomes a foundation for moral order, teaching the next generation the consequences of tyranny. Creativity reclaims public space. Festivals, art exhibitions, and literary circles flourish. Culture becomes a living archive of resistance, memory, and hope, proving that human expression cannot be permanently silenced by oppression. The rise and fall of a tyrant is ultimately a story of resilience. Societies endure, human conscience prevails, and life continues. Power may dominate temporarily, but morality, courage, and collective action endure. History records the lesson: tyranny is transient, humanity is eternal. Tyranny does not exist in isolation. Along the borders, neighboring states observed carefully, trading cautiously, preparing contingencies. Refugees crossed quietly, carrying stories that spread beyond the tyrant's reach. These borderlands became spaces of transmission, where fear transformed into testimony and regional awareness grew. Foreign envoys measured every word. Public diplomacy masked private concern, as alliances frayed and credibility eroded. The tyrant's reputation abroad shifted from strength to instability. History shows that legitimacy, once questioned internationally, is difficult to restore at home. Economic decline followed political excess. Resources were diverted to security and spectacle, while production faltered. Inflation eroded savings, shortages strained patience, and prosperity receded. The material consequences of tyranny made abstract grievances tangible, accelerating dissent. Public ceremonies continued, but their meaning changed. Applause sounded thinner, enthusiasm rehearsed. The spectacle of power persisted, yet its substance waned. When performance replaces conviction, authority becomes fragile, dependent on illusion rather than consent. Women played critical roles, often unseen. They organized networks, carried messages, and sustained families under pressure. Their leadership, understated yet decisive, challenged traditional power structures and demonstrated that resistance draws strength from every segment of society. Detention facilities filled with dissidents, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. Silence became a form of punishment. Yet even here, solidarity endured. Shared glances, remembered names, and the quiet preservation of dignity defied the intent to erase identity. Law was reshaped to serve power. Decrees replaced deliberation, legality replaced justice. Such manipulation offered short-term control but long-term instability. When law loses legitimacy, compliance becomes coercion, and governance drifts toward collapse. State media projected certainty and order. Yet alternative channels, rumors, foreign broadcasts, personal testimony, circulated relentlessly. Control of information delayed reckoning but could not prevent it. Truth, fragmented but persistent, reasserted itself. Cities bore the marks of neglect. Infrastructure deteriorated, services faltered, and public spaces became arenas of expression. Spontaneous gatherings signaled a shift from fear to collective presence, a visible reclaiming of civic space. Late reforms arrived without trust. Intelligence was flawed, dissent underestimated. Each miscalculation compounded the next. History often turns on such moments, when adaptation comes too late and rigidity seals fate. In rural regions, hardship fostered solidarity. Communities shared labor and resources, sustaining one another through scarcity. These bonds, forged under pressure, proved resilient and formed the backbone of broader resistance. Elders recalled earlier freedoms, youth imagined futures denied to them. Dialogue between generations bridged memory and aspiration. Together, they formed a continuum of resistance rooted in experience and hope. As support eroded, a core of loyalists remained, bound by ideology, fear, or shared culpability. Their resolve intensified even as numbers fell. Such loyalty, concentrated and inflexible, often hastens violent endings. Pressure converged. Protests aligned, strikes synchronized, and regions acted in concert. The sense of inevitability spread. When collective action reaches critical mass, the balance of power shifts decisively. Retreat followed confrontation. Gates closed, movements restricted, communication narrowed. The ruler who once commanded vast spaces now occupied shrinking ground, both physically and politically. Negotiations emerged amid uncertainty. Ultimatums replaced dialogue. Each hour carried consequence. Such moments test whether power yields to compromise or clings to force, shaping the character of transition. The announcement came without ceremony. Authority transferred, symbols removed, commands rescinded. The end of rule, often anticlimactic, marked a profound shift, proof that even entrenched power can dissolve abruptly. Relief mingled with uncertainty. Institutions paused, citizens assessed, and the future remained undefined. Transition is neither instant nor simple, it unfolds through careful reconstruction and restraint. Records were examined, testimonies preserved. Memory became an instrument of accountability. By documenting the past, society sought not revenge, but understanding, an essential step toward durable stability. The rise and fall of a tyrant reveals enduring truths. Power requires accountability, fear corrodes legitimacy, and societies possess a quiet strength that outlasts domination. In the long arc of history, governance rooted in consent endures, while tyranny, however formidable, remains temporary.